how people actually get the support.
Poto Williams.
Pleasure to take a call on the Social Security Fraud Measures and Debt Recovery Amendment Bill, which is about fraud measures, but it's also about debt recovery. The recovery of debt from our most poor and vulnerable, the recovery of debt from beneficiaries whom actually owe their most significant amount of debt to the government. So it's very interesting that we're talking about recovering debt by the government when they are actually looking at recovering debt from those who owe them the government the most. And we supported this with some grave reservations, and the reservations that we talk about are really around the principles of general law. I mean, I want to talk about a couple of specific clauses within the bill itself. However, I do want to frame my discussions around one or two principles. The principle that the New Zealand Law Society, that many of my colleagues have already talked about, and I want to quote what was said, is that in the absence of a positive act which would normally provide grounds for criminal liability, the justification for making partners and spouses criminally liable is not apparent. So we're taking a departure from the general principles of criminal law. Normally a positive act is required to ground that within criminal activities. So what we're in essence saying that the person who has actually committed the crime, the responsibility for that crime has actually shifted to another party. I don't know of any other legislation, perhaps my colleagues can help me on this, where the committing of a crime is actually the responsibility is held by another party. Perhaps that does exist, perhaps it doesn't, but I don't believe that we are talking about something that is consistent with the principles of criminal law. I'm pleased that the Minister is back in the chair, because I wanted to say that it's lovely to see you again, Minister Burrows. We've seen you a bit in Christchurch recently, and along with other government ministers and government MPs, and I wonder if that's because Christchurch is, of course, one of those touchstone places where the government realises that they have actually done a terrible, terrible job, and they're sending the troops in to actually try and recover some of that. So it's lovely to see you again. I've seen you quite a bit over the last few weeks. But I wanted to comment on something the Minister said around fraud, and that it is all about fraud. What I want to question is how much of the actual investigation is fraud, when a large component of what is found is actually administrative errors by the ministry itself. No. So we are talking about quite a significant percentage of error. And when we're talking about this percentage of administrative error that occurs, we're talking about having the right paperwork within the right time frames, signed by the right coloured ink. We are talking about barriers that are put in the way for beneficiaries to actually find and have access to benefits that they are actually entitled to under legislation. They are entitled to these benefits. However, we put all sorts of barriers in their way, and when we as the administrators get it wrong, they are the ones that have the penalty, and I don't think that's right. It's another example of us vilifying the beneficiaries, actually taking another, as my colleague puts it, beating our beneficiaries yet again. And there's no clearer example of this government being out of touch with what's happening with beneficiaries than, I don't know if many of you saw the news reports on Sunday, the Young Nats ball, where we had the Child Protection Action Group outside protesting, and there was this fantastic shot of the Young Nats on the balcony sipping their champagne while they were looking down at the protesters. I mean, that's a classic let them eat cake, isn't it? So here we are with this government completely out of touch with what's happening with our most poor and our most vulnerable. So I want to go to one of the specifics of this piece of this bill, and that is recovery from the spouse or the partner. I know that there's some debate over what is the definition of partner or spouse. I haven't actually seen it clearly articulated. Mr Chairman.
Poto Williams.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I haven't seen it clearly articulated because I would like to know what defines a partner or spouse in this type of environment. Are we talking about, we have had this, I know this has been part of the debate in the past, however we're talking about people cohabitating within the same space, within the same house, and who is actually going to define what is a partnership or what is a spousal relationship? Are we going to leave that to the ministry? More forms, I guess, and more tests. Many of our colleagues have already spoken about the issue of domestic violence as part of this bill, and that those people, women particularly, who are impacted by domestic violence will be able to provide a test and then will not be responsible for the recovery of fraud. And I remember a member across the House speaking about this the last time we were talking about this particular bill. Well, here again I want to know who is going to administer this test. What is this test going to look like? And will it require the further filling in of forms? Will it require affidavits to be supplied by the women concerned? And who is going to be responsible for that? Is it going to be Work and Income New Zealand, who we know by their very culture are very caring and are very, very concerned for our population? I would hate to think of vulnerable women turning up at Work and Income to disclose domestic violence to some of the folk that we have working within our Work and Income environment, and I think that's actually an appalling way to treat people. I want to talk about the spouse, 127A, the spousal partner knowing or being reckless about whether it was the fraud was obtained by beneficiary fraud. Here I want to quote my learned colleague Jacinda Ardern when she spoke during one of the readings, where she says the spouse can still be found liable if they ought to have known that they were in receipt of a benefit fraudulently, and that this is actually quite a hard test. So it's probed to quite a high degree, and I understand that the Social Services Committee that came away with two questions: to what degree the test could be applied to other forms of fraud, and whether it should be. And I don't think that we have heard sufficient evidence or sufficient discussion on whether we should be applying this consistently across the whole environment when we are talking about fraud. I want to go back to my initial statements about the general principles of criminal law and the shift of responsibility from the person who actually perpetrates that criminal act to another person, and whether we are talking about a real shift in our legislative thinking, because who is to say who may not be in danger of falling foul should we want to use this particular principle in another piece of legislation, Mr Chairman. So just in summing up, I would like to know about how we are going to get through this process of disclosure, whether there will be organisations who work with vulnerable people who will grapple with the notion of disclosure, and when they're working with people and these disclosures happen, whether we will then require people such as our social workers, our support staff, to then disclose the criminal behaviour of people that they work with. This particular piece of criminal law has an opportunity to impact many, many other pieces of legislation, and I, for one, Mr Chairman, don't think that that is right. Thank you.
Mr Chair.
Maggie Barry.
Mr Chair.
The question be now put.
Yeah, the question is that the question be now put. Those of that opinion will say aye. Contrary, no. Party vote. Clerk will conduct a party vote.
New Zealand National.
59 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes opposed.
Green Party.
14 votes opposed.
New Zealand First.
7 votes in favour.
Māori Party.
3 votes in favour.
Mana,
1 opposed.
ACT New Zealand.
1 in favour.
United Future,
1 in favour.
Brendan Horan.
The ayes are 71, the noes 49. The question will now be put, and the question is that part 1 stand part. Those of that opinion will say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The question now is that part 2 stand part. Sue Moroney.
Oh, thank you, Mr Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on part 2, which is the consequential